48 hours before his wedding, Vaughn Moreau discovered that the only woman who knew every secret of his empire had vanished, and she was the only thing standing between him and a carefully planned death. This is not a love story. This is not a wedding story. This is a story about betrayal, blood, and the moment a man who controlled an entire city realized he had trusted the wrong people for years. Stay until the end. Hit like so this story can travel further, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far these shadows have reached. The morning began the way most dangerous mornings did, quietly. Vaughn Moreau stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 43rd floor penthouse and watched the harbor below him breathe in the gray pre-dawn light. Container ships moved like slow ghosts across the water. Cranes held their steel arms frozen against a sky the color of old ash. From this height, the port looked almost peaceful. It looked like something that could be owned cleanly, managed neatly, controlled without cost. He had spent 22 years learning that nothing about it was any of those things. He was dressed already, dark shirt, collar open at the throat, jacket folded over the chair behind him. He hadn't slept. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had always been something he negotiated with rather than surrendered to. A few hours grabbed between phone calls, between decisions, between the kind of problems that didn't have clean solutions. Tonight, the problem had a name, and the name was already sitting wrong in his chest before he fully understood why. Alara Voss had not sent the morning report. It was 6:42. The morning report arrived every day at 6:15 without exception. In 7 years, Alara had missed it exactly once, when her mother had a stroke and she'd spent the night in a hospital corridor, and even then she had emailed him at 6:22 with a 3-line summary and a note that said she would brief him fully by 8. That was the kind of woman she was. The kind who could be sitting in a hospital waiting for news about her dying mother and still find 60 seconds to make sure his operation didn't stumble. He checked his phone again. Nothing. He told himself it was the wedding. The last 2 weeks had been brutal with logistics. Caterers, security rotations, the delicate political theater of merging 2 criminal dynasties under one ceremonial roof. Alara had been managing all of it in addition to her standard responsibilities. Maybe she had simply overslept. Maybe she had finally, for once in her life, allowed herself one morning of ordinary human failure. He almost believed it. He called her direct line. It rang 7 times and rolled to voicemail. He hung up and called again. Same result. He sent a text. 2 words, no punctuation, the way he always communicated when he needed a fast answer. Report now. He set the phone face down on the window ledge and watched the harbor for another 4 minutes. When he turned it over, the screen was empty. The thing that lived in Vaughn Moreau's gut, the instinct he'd spent 2 decades sharpening until it was less a feeling and more a physical alarm, went very quiet and very cold. He picked up a different phone. The one he kept in the inner pocket of his jacket, registered to a name that didn't exist. Marcus. His voice was flat. Find Alara, now. Not in an hour, now. Celeste Harrington arrived at 9 with a florist's portfolio and a smile engineered to disarm. She was 29 years old and beautiful in the architectural way of women who had been raised to understand that beauty was a tool, and she deployed it with the precision of someone who had never once confused the tool for the goal. Her dark hair was pinned back. Her coat was charcoal cashmere. She walked into Vaughn's penthouse like she already owned it, because in 46 hours, by the logic of the arrangement their families had negotiated over 18 months, she more or less would. Vaughn watched her come in and felt nothing in particular. That was not new. What was new was that today, the absence of feeling registered as data rather than comfort. You look exhausted, she said, setting the portfolio on the dining table without asking. Did you sleep? Where's your father this morning? She paused the way trained people pause, briefly, controlled, recoverable. Breakfast meeting. Why? Just asking. She tilted her head. The smile stayed where she'd put it. Vaughn, we have 12 decisions to make before noon about the reception layout. Can we focus? Alara hasn't checked in. Celeste opened the portfolio. She's probably overwhelmed. You've had her running everything for 2 weeks straight. Give the woman a morning. She doesn't take mornings. Maybe she finally learned how. She laid out a seating chart that someone had rendered in precise black ink. Table configuration. Your people need to be separated from mine until after the ceremony, or your lieutenant, the one with the temper, Rourke, is going to say something that starts a problem before we're legally bound to each other." Vaughn looked at the seating chart. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when he's not actually looking at it at all. His mind was on a different map: the city grid, the apartment Alara kept in the Thornfield district, the route between there and his office, the 6 people who had standing access to her schedule. "Cancel the florist for this afternoon," he said. Celeste looked up. "Excuse me?" "Tell them we'll reschedule. I have something I need to handle." "We have 46 hours, Vaughn." "I'm aware of that." Her eyes moved across his face with the careful attention of someone reading a contract for unfavorable clauses. "This is about Alara. It's about my operation. She is not your operation. She is your employee. She manages the financial architecture of everything I run. She has access to account structures, shipping manifests, and coordination schedules that are worth more to an enemy than anything else I own." He said it without heat because it was simply true. If she's unreachable, that is not a staffing inconvenience. That is a security event. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a precision that he filed away, "I'm sure she's fine." Marcus Hale had been with Vaughn for 11 years, since before the consolidation, since before the harbor contracts, since a period of the organization's history that neither of them discussed directly, but that had forged something between them that functioned like loyalty without requiring the word. He was a compact man, quiet-moving, with a face that people forgot immediately and remembered only when it was too late. He had been to Alara's apartment. He called Vaughn from the street outside it at 10:47. "Her car's here, lights are off, mail in the box from yesterday." "Door?" "Locked. No sign of forced entry from the outside." "Get inside." A pause. Sound of movement. Then silence for almost 90 seconds. Then Marcus's voice came back different, lower, tighter, stripped of its usual neutral efficiency. "She's not here, but she was. Recently." Another pause. "There's blood on the kitchen floor. Not a lot. A trail. Looks like it goes toward the back." Vaughn was already moving toward the elevator. "Preserve it. Nobody in or out. I'm coming." "Vaughn!" Marcus's voice stopped him. "The secondary filing cabinet. The locked one she keeps in the bedroom closet. It's been forced." "What was in it?" "I don't know what was in it. But whatever it was, it's gone." But he drove himself. That was not his usual practice. He had people for driving, people for watching, people for the dozen categories of tasks that required a body between him and the city. But there were moments when distance between himself and information was a liability he couldn't afford, and this was one of them. He took the gray sedan he kept in the building's secondary garage, registered to a shell company, and moved through mid-morning traffic with his jaw tight and his mind running calculations. Alara Voss had come to him 7 years ago through a referral from a forensic accountant who had since retired to Portugal and rarely communicated. She'd had a background in financial logistics, legitimate background, clean record, the kind of resume that looked almost too straightforward. What she'd had, underneath the clean record, was a mind that processed complexity the way other people processed air, automatically, continuously, without apparent effort. She had looked at the tangled financial architecture of Vaughn's operation in her first month and quietly restructured it in a way that reduced his exposure by 40% and increased operational efficiency by more. She had never once been wrong about a number. She had never once missed a deadline. She had never once, in 7 years, given him any reason to doubt her. He tried to remember the last time he had actually looked at her, not at the report she was presenting or the problem she was solving, but at her. He couldn't place it clearly. She was a presence in his operation the way load-bearing walls were a presence in a building. Essential, invisible, something you only thought about when you imagined what would happen if they weren't there. He was thinking about it now. She was 34 years old. She lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Thornfield because she'd mentioned once, a long time ago, that she liked the quiet. She had a mother somewhere. He knew that because there had been the hospital incident, and because occasionally she arrived slightly tired in a way that was different from work tired. And he had eventually understood without being told that there was a sick parent being managed on the margins of her life. She had never complained about it. She had never asked for accommodation. She had simply managed it the way she managed everything else, efficiently, privately, without making it anyone else's problem. He had never asked her about it directly. He could see that now with a clarity that had the particular quality of clarity that arrives too late. Alara's apartment building was a 6-story structure of aging red brick on a street that had been promising redevelopment for years without delivering it. Vaughn parked 2 blocks away and walked, his collar up, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who belonged wherever he happened to be. Marcus was waiting at the building's side entrance, holding it open with one shoulder. The apartment was on the 4th floor. The stairwell smelled of old carpet and cooking. Vaughn took the stairs without speaking. Marcus followed. The apartment door was open, held at an angle by a folded piece of cardboard that Marcus had wedged there to avoid triggering the latch. Inside, the space was neat in the way that Vaughn would have expected. Orderly, spare, nothing excessive. A desk against one wall with a second monitor that matched the setup in her office. Bookshelves that were actually used. A kitchen that was clean and functional without being decorative. The blood was on the kitchen floor near the island counter. It wasn't a large amount, not the volume that meant something catastrophic had happened here. It was the volume that meant someone had been hurt and mobile. There was a smear on the edge of the counter at hip height, and then a trail of drops, irregular spacing, moving toward the back hallway. The pattern suggested she had been moving fast, or had been moved fast. Vaughn crouched beside the largest concentration of it. It had dried dark. His jaw worked. "How old?" he asked. 8 to 12 hours, Marcus said. Rough estimate. That put it between 11 last night and 3 in the morning. Vaughn stood. He moved through the apartment with careful attention, touching nothing, reading the space the way he had trained himself to read spaces over many years. The bedroom was undisturbed except for the closet. The filing cabinet Marcus had mentioned was steel, low profile, the kind sold as a fireproof document safe. It had been opened with force. The locking mechanism bent outward, the drawer itself slightly warped from the angle of the entry. It had been done quickly, by someone who knew what they were after and didn't have time to be delicate about it. On the desk, her laptop was closed. He opened it. The screen asked for a password. He closed it again and handed it to Marcus with a look that communicated without requiring words. On the shelf above the desk, between 2 volumes on international shipping law, he found something she had apparently left deliberately. A thumb drive. Small, black, the kind that cost $4 and held an enormous amount. Taped to it was a piece of paper folded in quarters. He unfolded it. The handwriting was Alara's. He recognized it from 7 years of annotated reports. It said, "If you're reading this, you're already behind. Check the Meridian files. Trust the numbers. Don't trust the ceremony." He read it twice. Then he put the drive in his pocket and the note in his jacket and stood in her empty apartment for a long moment with the weight of 11 words pressing against his sternum. Don't trust the ceremony. He called in 3 people from his security architecture team and had Alara's laptop on a clean system within 2 hours. What was on it was not immediately accessible. She had layered her encryption in a way that suggested she had anticipated exactly this scenario. But the team found the outer structure of the files, the directory names, the timestamps. The most recently modified folder was labeled, in her characteristically efficient naming system, MH Contingency. It had been last accessed at 10:47 the previous night, 40 minutes before the estimated start of the blood evidence. The thumb drive was a different architecture, simpler, as though it had been prepared quickly, assembled for a specific reader under time pressure. Vaughn sat alone with it in his private office on the building's 39th floor, the door locked, the phone forwarding everything to Marcus, and read what Alara had put on it. It took him 90 minutes to read it completely. By the end of it, his hands were still, and his face was very controlled, and something behind his eyes had gone the specific temperature of a man who has just understood the actual dimensions of a problem that he thought was a different, smaller problem entirely. The Harrington family had not come to merge. They had come to absorb. The financial documentation was precise. Alara had always been precise. And it laid out an 18-month campaign with the clarity of something that had been assembled over time by someone who was deeply familiar with both organizations' structures. The Harrington network had been quietly acquiring controlling interests in the subsidiary companies that served as buffers between Vaughn's legitimate holdings and his operational assets. Not enough to trigger visibility, enough to create leverage that would activate at a specific moment. The moment of the wedding, there were communication logs, sourced, Vaughn understood, from somewhere inside the Harrington infrastructure, which meant Alara had a contact there she had never mentioned. That outlined a sequence of events planned for the rehearsal dinner. A specific bottle of wine, a medical event, staged to appear cardiac. Vaughn would be incapacitated. His senior people would be managed. He found the word in the document and felt its weight in the chaos that followed. The shipping network, the port contracts, the financial channels, all of it would be presented as already transferred to the Harrington organization under documentation that had been prepared in advance. It was clean. It was patient. It was the work of people who had been planning it far longer than they had been negotiating the alliance. And then he found the second layer. His eyes moved across the page and stopped. The source of Harrington's detailed intelligence about Vaughn's internal structure, the specifics that would have been impossible to obtain from the outside, the operational details that only someone deeply embedded in the organization could have provided, was identified in Alara's notes with her characteristic refusal to be indirect about things that needed to be said directly. The name was Desmond Moreau, his uncle, his mother's brother, the man who had taught him the first principles of the port operation at 16, who had stood beside him through the consolidation, who sat at the right side of every significant table in Vaughn's world. Vaughn read the name 4 times. He set the drive down on the desk. He stood up and went to the window and stood with his back to the room for a long time. Outside, the harbor moved in its ancient, indifferent way. Ships, cranes, water the color of cold steel. He found Marcus waiting outside the office door. Marcus looked at his face and said nothing for a moment. "How bad?" Marcus finally asked. "Worse than I knew." Vaughn's voice was measured. The evenness of it cost something that he didn't examine. "I need eyes on Desmond. Passive. Nothing visible. I need to know where he is, who he's speaking with, where he spent last night." Marcus absorbed this without visible reaction. "And Alara? She's alive." He said it as a statement rather than a hope, because allowing it to be a hope would be a kind of softness he couldn't afford right now. "She ran. She was hurt. She was running, and she put information in my hands before she did. She's alive." "You don't know that." "I know her," Vaughn said. "She doesn't do things without a purpose. The drive was placed where I would find it, and not where someone searching the apartment quickly would find it. She was thinking clearly when she left. She was injured but operational." He paused. "She's somewhere she calculated was safe enough. Find her." "That's a large city. She's methodical. She'd go somewhere that fit a logic. Not a hotel. Too much exposure, cameras, credit trails. Not a friend's place. She doesn't have many, and she'd know we'd check the obvious ones." He thought about the woman he had spent 7 years observing without, apparently, truly seeing. She'd go somewhere she'd already identified as a contingency. She would have thought about this scenario before it happened. She thinks about scenarios before they happen. Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll start with the Thornfield adjacent grid and move out from there. Properties that could be accessed without a transaction, abandoned buildings, long-term rentals under business names. Do it fast." He turned back toward the office. Marcus stopped him with, "Vaughn, the wedding preparations are still running. Celeste's people have been calling about the afternoon walkthrough." Vaughn considered this for 3 seconds. "Let them run. Nothing changes on that front until I decide it changes. If anyone from the Harrington organization asks about my schedule, I'm occupied with security logistics. That's not even a lie. And if Desmond calls?" Vaughn's face did something brief and controlled and finished quickly. "Tell him I'll call him back." The afternoon ground forward in the gray light of a city that didn't know what was building inside it. Vaughn worked through the surface requirements of the day. 2 calls with the venue coordinator that he handled with a performance of normalcy that cost him a specific kind of focus, while his mind ran the other track continuously, processing what he had read, cross-referencing it against 7 years of memory, finding the places where Desmond's access and timing aligned with the intelligence that Alara's document showed had been transferred to the Harrington organization. It aligned cleanly, horribly cleanly. The consolidation meeting 3 years ago where the port's northern access agreement had been finalized, Desmond had been present, had handled the secondary documentation, had been the one to courier the final copies to the legal structure. Alara's notes showed that within 72 hours of that meeting, the Harrington network had begun quietly acquiring a shipping company that held one of the Northern Access licenses. The staffing restructure 18 months ago, when Vaughn had reorganized the security rotation at the warehouse complex on the eastern docks. Desmond had been involved in reviewing the new schedules. Alara's notes showed that the Harrington security contractor, a company that appeared in 3 of the documents as the operational arm for the planned takeover, had begun hiring people with very specific skill sets approximately 60 days after that restructure. The skill sets matched the schedules exactly. He thought about sitting across a table from Desmond, who had gray at his temples now, and a habit of cleaning his glasses when he was thinking, and he thought about all the rooms he had allowed that man to enter without a second thought, because the man had been in his life longer than the organization had existed. Around 4 in the afternoon, Marcus called, "I found her." The relief was immediate and physical, and he pressed it down hard. "Where?" "Abandoned textile facility in the Corrigan district, eastern edge, near the bridge approach. She broke the lock on a secondary entrance. It was resecured from the inside." A pause. "Vaughn, she's in bad shape. I got eyes through a ground floor window. She's not moving well." "Don't go in. She'll be armed and she won't be expecting friendlies." "I figured. I'm coming. 40 minutes. Hold the perimeter. Nobody approaches." He was already reaching for his jacket. The Corrigan district was the part of the city that development hadn't reached yet and didn't appear to be rushing toward. Former industrial blocks, buildings with their windows replaced by plywood, streets where the streetlights worked only intermittently, and the remaining businesses had security gates that stayed down even during business hours. The textile facility was a 3-story concrete structure on a corner lot, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had sections sagging toward the ground. Vaughn went in through the same secondary entrance she had used. The lock had been resecured with a wire arrangement that was makeshift but functional. He disassembled it carefully and slipped inside. The interior was vast and dark, the ceiling lost in shadow, the floor space divided by rows of old machinery frames that had been stripped of their working components. The air smelled of rust, old fabric, cold concrete. Somewhere in the upper structure, wind moved through a broken pane. He moved through the darkness by memory and instinct in the faint light that fell through gaps in the boarded windows. He found her on the second floor, in a corner space between 2 large equipment frames that she had chosen, he understood immediately, because they provided sight lines to both the stairwell and the emergency exit. She was sitting with her back against the concrete wall and her legs extended, and she had a compact firearm in her right hand that came up the moment she heard his footsteps. "Alara." The gun stayed up for 1 beat. Then it lowered. She exhaled, the sound of someone who has been holding something very tight for a very long time, and turned her face away from him for a moment. He crossed to her and crouched down and looked at her in the gray light. She had been beaten. Her left eye was swollen, nearly closed. There was a cut across her cheekbone that needed stitches, and from the way she was holding her left side, at least 1 rib was cracked, possibly more. The wound on her abdomen, visible through a tear in her shirt where she'd improvised a bandage from her jacket lining, was the one that concerned him most. The bandage was darkly stained. She had been managing this for hours. "You found the drive," she said. Her voice was steady. That was her throughout, controlled, direct, refusing to give circumstances the satisfaction of her losing composure. "I found it. The Meridian files. I read them." She looked at him. Her good eye was very clear. "All of them?" "All of them." He held her gaze. "Desmond." Something moved across her face. Not surprise. She had known he would reach that part. Something more like the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a terrible piece of information and finally set it down. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't have enough to bring to you until 3 weeks ago. And then I needed time to build the documentation in a way that was irrefutable, because I knew—" She stopped, breathed carefully around what was evidently significant rib pain. "I knew you'd need it to be irrefutable." He didn't say anything to that. He reached out and carefully peeled back the edge of her improvised bandage. The wound underneath was a stab wound, clean entry, which was the only good thing about it, and it had bled substantially and was showing early signs of infection around the edges. "Who did this?" he asked. 2 of them. Harrington's people, I think, but accessed through someone who knew my schedule. She didn't say Desmond's name again. She didn't need to. They came for the files. I got out with the drives, and they caught up with me in the stairwell. Her mouth tightened briefly. I persuaded them to stop following. He looked at her and thought about a woman alone in a stairwell with 2 men who had come to silence her, and the firearm that had come up fast and sure when she'd heard his footsteps. Can you walk? I've been walking. That's not what I asked. Her good eye held something that in different circumstances might have been dry humor. Yes, I can walk. Then we're leaving. I have a physician I trust. He moved to help her stand, and she accepted the assistance with the expression of someone who understood accepting help as a tactical decision rather than a concession. When she was upright, he felt the tension of the effort it cost her in the grip of her hand on his arm, and said nothing about it because she would not have wanted him to. They were halfway to the stairs when she stopped him. The warehouse, she said. The Eastern Docks complex. The Harrington operation. They're planning a move on it. The documents put the window at before dawn. They want to establish physical control of the space before the wedding. He had read this. He had been running the timeline in his mind all afternoon. I know. And Desmond will have given them the updated security rotation. I know that too. She looked at him in the darkness of the abandoned building. This woman who had spent 7 years keeping his empire intact from a position of quiet invisibility, who had been beaten and stabbed and had spent the night alone on a concrete floor because she had decided that the information she carried was worth protecting with her body. And she said, "What are you going to do?" Vaughn looked at the stairwell. He looked at the harbor direction, though he couldn't see it from here. He thought about the wedding arrangement still running in the background of his life like a program he'd forgotten to close. "I'm going to take her to the physician," he said, "and then I'm going to make some decisions that can't be unmade." He helped her toward the stairs, moving carefully, adjusting his pace to hers without drawing attention to the adjustment. Behind them, the abandoned building breathed its cold industrial breath, and somewhere below Marcus was waiting, and somewhere across the city, Desmond Moreau was sitting down to dinner without knowing that his nephew had spent the afternoon reading every detail of what he'd done. And somewhere in a harborside venue, the wedding preparations were moving forward on a timeline built around a dead man's compliance. The drive was in Vaughn's pocket. The note was in his jacket. The name he could not stop reading in his mind was written in Alara's handwriting. Precise, unsparing, correct. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Alara's grip on his arm tightened briefly, not in weakness, but in something that was, for just a moment, not professional at all. He didn't comment on it. He kept moving. Outside, Marcus was at the perimeter. The city went about its evening in complete ignorance. The harbor, 3 miles east, moved its cargo and breathed its cold water breath and waited. Somewhere in the Eastern Docks complex, men who believed they were walking into an undefended space were beginning to position themselves for a move that was scheduled to happen before dawn. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Neither yet did Vaughn Moreau, because the full contents of the Meridian files included one final document that he had opened but not yet read. A document that Alara had labeled simply Final Layer, and which she had, as he helped her into the back of the waiting car, told him with her eyes closed and her voice very controlled that he needed to read before he made any decisions about the night ahead. He pulled the door shut. Marcus pulled away from the curb. In his pocket, the drive waited. Whatever was in the final layer was going to change something. He could feel it the way he felt all the things that were about to change, in the cold, specific weight of them, in the way the city looked through the window as they moved through it, ordinary and enormous and completely indifferent to what was about to happen inside it. He reached into his pocket. He opened the file, and the last assumption he had been holding on to, the one he hadn't even known he was still holding, collapsed completely. The final layer was not a financial document. It was a surveillance log. Vaughn read it in the back of the moving car while Marcus drove without asking questions, and Alara sat beside him with her head resting against the window and her eyes closed, her breathing the slow, careful breathing of someone managing pain by controlling every variable she could still control. The city moved past the glass in streaks of orange streetlight and dark gaps between. Vaughn read and did not speak. The log was 41 pages. Alara had assembled it over 11 months, sourcing from 3 separate channels: a contact inside the Harrington Communications Network, a financial forensics trail she had constructed herself, and a third source she had identified only as V-adjacent, which Vaughn understood meant someone inside his own structure who had been feeding her information without knowing that was what they were doing. She had been running a counter-surveillance operation inside his own organization while simultaneously running his organization. He had not known. He had not even suspected. That was its own thing to sit with. He set it aside. The log documented Desmond's communication with the Harrington family in granular detail. Dates, channels, content summaries. It went back further than Alara's notes had initially indicated. Not 18 months, not 2 years. 4 years. Desmond had been in contact with Gerard Harrington, Celeste's father, for 4 years. The first recorded communication predated the formal alliance negotiation by 2.5 years, which meant the alliance had not been proposed to Vaughn as a business arrangement between equals. It had been a closing mechanism, the end of a longer process that had been running quietly beneath everything while Vaughn ran his empire and trusted his uncle and planned a future that had been designed from the outside to end him. The final entry in the log was dated 6 days ago. It was a communication summary, and it contained a single line that Alara had highlighted and annotated in her precise handwriting. D confirms V schedule for rehearsal dinner, confirms physician access, confirms seating arrangement, puts V isolated from senior security personnel for minimum 12-minute window. Vaughn closed the file. He looked at the back of Marcus's head. He looked at Alara's reflection in the window glass, her eyes still closed, the damaged side of her face turned partially toward him, the swollen architecture of what had been done to her rendered in the passing light. "How long did you know?" he asked. She didn't open her eyes. That Desmond was involved specifically? 8 months. That something was wrong inside the structure. Closer to 2 years. 2 years. I didn't have proof. I had patterns. A pause. Careful breath. You don't bring a man's uncle to him based on patterns. He looked out the window. No, he said. You don't. The physician was a compact Hungarian woman named Dr. Fenyes, who had been treating the organization's injuries for 9 years and had long ago made her peace with the nature of the work. She operated from a converted basement space in a brownstone in the Aldermere district, and she received Alara without visible alarm, which was one of the things Vaughn valued about her. He waited in the outer room while Dr. Fenyes worked. The outer room was spare. 2 chairs, a small table, a shelf of medical reference texts that looked actually used. He sat in one of the chairs and called Marcus, who was parked outside. Desmond's location. His apartment, far as we can tell. Car hasn't moved since 6. Light in the window. Keep it covered. He paused. What about movement from the Harrington side? Celeste's people have been trying to reach you for the last 3 hours about the rehearsal logistics. I've been managing that. A brief silence. And there's been some movement from the Harrington security contractor. 2 vehicles that we've been tracking since this afternoon have repositioned. They're sitting on the eastern approach to the docks complex right now. Vaughn felt the evening's timeline click into sharper focus. How many? From what we can see, those 2 vehicles are advanced positioning. If the pattern holds, they'll bring the full team in late, after midnight, when the dock security rotation creates a gap. He had read the operational plan in Alara's documents. He knew the gap they were counting on. He knew it because Desmond had given it to them. How many in my current dock team? 8 on the rotation that starts at midnight, but Vaughn, if Desmond compromised the schedule, they may know exactly where each of those 8 people will be positioned. He thought about 8 men going to work at a harbor complex in the middle of the night, not knowing that their positions had been sold to the people planning to walk through them. Pull them, quietly. I don't want anyone in that building when those vehicles move. And replace them with? Nothing yet. Leave it dark. I want those teams to arrive and find what they expect to find. Marcus processed this. And then I'll tell you what comes next. He ended the call and sat in the quiet of the outer room with his forearms on his knees and his hands loose between them and his mind working through the sequence of the night. There was a version of this that was clean and fast. Hit the dock complex, intercept the Harrington advance team, use the physical evidence to blow the alliance apart publicly, and let the wreckage speak. There was a version that was slower and more surgical, that allowed the operation to proceed further before cutting it off. There were versions that involved Desmond and versions that deferred that problem. He was still sorting through them when Dr. Feniers came to the doorway. "She'll need 3 days of rest, which I doubt she'll take," the doctor said, in the flat, practical tone of someone who had learned to deliver medical recommendations as statements of aspiration rather than expectation. "The stab wound is clean, no organ involvement. Infection is early stage. I've started antibiotics. 2 cracked ribs. The facial injuries are superficial. She's been through worse, I think, and managed it. Can she talk?" "She's been talking since I started working on her. I don't think you can stop that one." He went in. Alara was sitting up on the examination table with the expression of someone who had been told to lie down and had decided that was not going to happen. She had a fresh bandage on her abdomen and an IV line running antibiotics into her left arm. The swelling on her face looked worse in the clean light of the examination room than it had in the darkness of the textile facility. "Desmond doesn't know what I have," she said, before he could say anything. "He knows I found something. That's why he sent those men, but he doesn't know the scope of it. He'll know soon enough that I have it." "Not if he thinks I'm dead." She said it with the same flat precision she used for financial projections. "They didn't confirm the result. If they had, you'd have heard about it differently, which means as of right now, Desmond is sitting somewhere in this city not knowing whether the problem he created has been resolved." Vaughn looked at her. "You want to let him keep thinking that? For as long as it's useful, yes. It buys us a few hours at most. When the dock operation goes sideways, they'll assume a security failure on their own end, not necessarily a leak from Desmond. That gives us more time." She shifted on the table and controlled the resulting expression with visible effort. "What I need to know is what you're planning to do with him." The room was quiet. The IV drip marked time in small, regular sounds. "That's not a question I'm answering tonight," Vaughn said. "It's a question that affects everything else you decide tonight, so yes, it is." He looked at her steadily. "You've been running a counter-surveillance operation inside my organization for the better part of a year without telling me. You've been sitting on evidence against my uncle for 8 months. You've been managing all of it while simultaneously doing your job and while apparently being tracked by Harrington's people to the point where they knew your schedule well enough to send 2 men to your apartment at midnight." "But Moss, sits." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you a question. One question, and I want you to answer it straight." She held his gaze. "All right. Why didn't you come to me sooner?" The question sat in the room. Alara looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was not the operational readiness she usually presented. It was something older and less managed. "Because the last person who brought Desmond Moreau a problem," she said, "was your operations manager before me, and he retired very suddenly to a place I've never been able to confirm exists." The silence that followed that statement was of a particular quality. Vaughn did not look away from her. "You thought I knew," he said. Not an accusation, a reading of what she'd said. "I thought there was a version of this where you knew, and a version where you didn't, and I needed to be certain of which version I was in before I handed you something that could get me killed 6 different ways." She said it without apology. "It took me a long time to be certain." He thought about what that meant. A woman sitting in his organization year after year, doing her job with absolute precision, while simultaneously running a private internal audit of whether the man she worked for was complicit in the conspiracy she was uncovering. Arriving every morning, presenting every report, watching him across tables in the way he now understood she had been watching him, which was not the way he had imagined he was being watched. "And," he said, "you're not part of it." Her voice was flat. "You're the target of it. There's a difference, and it matters." "I'm glad we established that." Something crossed her face that was brief and almost sharp, not quite the dry humor from the textile facility, something more complicated than that. She looked away from him for a moment, toward the wall, and when she looked back, the operational readiness was back in place. "The dock operation will move between 1 and 3 a.m., she said. "That's the window. If you're going to do something about it, you need to start positioning in the next 2 hours." "I know. And Celeste is going to receive a call from me before midnight canceling the walkthrough for tomorrow morning. I'll cite a security concern with the venue. She'll push back. I'll let her push back." He paused. I won't tell her anything real until I decide what real looks like. Elara nodded slowly. She'll report it to her father. Yes? That might accelerate their timeline. Possibly. He stood from the chair he'd pulled beside the table, which is why the next 2 hours matter. He moved toward the door. Behind him, Elara said, Vaughn. He stopped, didn't turn immediately. I have been working for you for 7 years, she said. In that time, I have made your operation financially bulletproof. I have caught 11 instances of internal skimming before they became structural problems. I have managed your exposure through 3 regulatory cycles that should have been catastrophic and were not. And I have spent the last 8 months building a case that has just saved your life. A pause. The IV drip. The antiseptic quiet. I am telling you this not because I want acknowledgement. I am telling you because I need you to understand that the reason I did all of it, the reason any of it, was not because you paid me to. He turned then. She was looking at him with the damaged side of her face partially toward the light, and her expression was stripped of all its professional scaffolding in a way he had never seen in 7 years. And whatever was underneath it was real and old, and had been in that room every time she'd been in a room with him, without him once having had the clarity to see it. He didn't have the right words for it. He was not certain he had ever had the right words for anything that mattered this way. So he said the only true thing he could find, when this is over, I want to talk about what comes next. Her expression didn't move. Go handle the doc. Yes. He went. Tch-tch. The call to Celeste lasted 4 minutes. He made it from the car while Marcus drove him toward the eastern edge of the city, where the harbor complex waited in its nighttime configuration of lights and shadow and moving water. Celeste answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting for the call. The venue's security team flagged an issue with the perimeter access, Vaughn said. I need to push the walkthrough to afternoon tomorrow. It's 11:30 at night, Vaughn. I'm aware of the time. This is the 3rd schedule change in 4 days. Her voice was even, but there was an edge beneath the evenness that he now heard differently than he had before. Not impatience. Calibration. She was measuring something. My father is going to ask me what's going on. Tell him I take security seriously. He should understand that. A pause. 3 seconds, which was slightly too long. Is everything all right? Everything is fine. I'll call you in the morning. He ended the call. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. She'll call him in the next 10 minutes, Marcus said. I know. Which means Gerard Harrington will know something shifted before midnight. Yes. That could push their dock operation earlier. Marcus. Vaughn looked at the passing streets, the city thinning out as they moved east toward the industrial waterfront, the lights getting more sparse, the buildings getting lower and darker and more industrial. How many people do you trust completely? Not contractually, not structurally, actually. Marcus considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. 6, maybe 7. Call them. I want them at the harbor staging point in 45 minutes. And the dock team we pulled? Redirect them to the secondary warehouse, not the main complex. If tonight goes badly, I want the secondary secured. He paused. And Marcus, nobody tells Desmond anything. Not where I am, not what I'm doing, not that anything is happening at all. Marcus nodded once. He made the calls. The city moved past the windows, and the harbor got closer, and the night got darker. And Vaughn Moreau rode toward the eastern docks with the weight of everything Elara had spent 8 months building sitting in his chest alongside the specific colder weight of his uncle's name, and the number 4, 4 years, running on a loop underneath everything else, a metronome he couldn't turn off. 4 years. He thought about every room he had shared with Desmond in 4 years, every meal, every decision made with the man's counsel factored in. Every time he had turned to the right side of a table and seen a face he trusted, a face that had been, the entire time, a transmission point for information flowing to the people who had just sent 2 men to stab his operations coordinator and leave her to die on a kitchen floor. The staging point was an old fish processing facility 2 blocks from the harbor complex. Marcus pulled in through the rear gate. 3 vehicles were already there, more arriving. Vaughn got out of the car. The air smelled of salt water and cold metal and old machinery. His people were gathering in the darkness, faces he knew, People who had been with him through difficult things before. People who had not been told yet what tonight actually was. He stood in front of them and looked at them and said, "The wedding is over. The alliance is over. What I'm about to tell you will explain why. And then we're going to go take back what was never actually given away." He told them. In the silence afterward, he watched their faces process it. The shock of the alliance, and then the worst shock of the name that came after. He watched a man named Rourke, who had worked alongside Desmond for 6 years, go very still in the way of a man who was revising a large portion of his recent history in real time. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Rourke said, in a voice stripped of everything except the question itself, "What do you need us to do?" And in the distance, from the direction of the harbor, came the sound of vehicles moving on the access road, engines too large for the hour, too many of them, arriving too soon. Celeste had made her call. Gerard had moved his timeline. They were already moving. Vaughn heard the engines before he saw the lights, a low, sustained growl coming from the northern access road, the kind of sound that too many vehicles made when they were trying to move quietly and failing because quiet wasn't what they'd planned for. They'd planned for a gap in security rotation and an empty building, and the particular confidence of men who believed the intelligence they were operating on was complete and current and hadn't already been turned against them. "How many vehicles?" Vaughn asked without raising his voice. Rourke had moved to the corner of the fish processing facility and was watching the access road through a gap in the corrugated siding. 4, maybe 5. They're running dark. No headlights on the last 2. Weapons? Can't tell yet. They're staged back from the complex perimeter, waiting for something. Vaughn understood what they were waiting for. The schedule Desmond had given them called for the dock security rotation to create its gap at 12:40. They had arrived early. Celeste's call to her father had accelerated the timeline, but not by much, because the operation had its own internal logic, and they weren't going to abandon the timing that the gap required. They were parked in the dark at the access road, engines idling, waiting for 12:40. It was 12:19. 21 minutes. He turned to the 7 people standing behind him in the shadows of the processing facility. Rourke. 2 men named Carver and Solis, who had handled the organization's security operations for years. 3 others whose specific capabilities were matched to what tonight required. And Marcus, who had pulled the whole group together in 45 minutes and was now standing slightly apart from the others in the way he always stood. Watchful, ready, taking up very little space for a man who mattered as much as he did. "We let them into the complex," Vaughn said. "We don't intercept on the road. I want them inside the building, away from their vehicles, committed to the operation before we move. Once they're in, the road team takes the vehicles. The interior team takes the building." He looked at each face in turn. "Nobody fires unless fired upon. I want prisoners. I want people who can be asked questions and who will answer them." He didn't say the other thing, that he needed bodies that could be attributed, evidence that could be structured, a record of what the Harrington organization had attempted tonight that would survive legal and criminal scrutiny and serve as the foundation of what came after. Alara had spent 8 months building the documentary case. He needed tonight to be the operational case. Together, they became something that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Rourke came back from the gap in the siding. "They've got at least 8 in the vehicles we can see. Could be more." Expected. The operational plan in Alara's files called for a 12-person entry team. He paused, which means they brought more than their plan called for. The room went slightly quieter. "Contingency?" Marcus asked. "Or confidence?" Vaughn moved toward the door. "Either way, our position doesn't change. We just adapt the margins." Sit. The harbor complex was a series of interconnected warehouse structures arranged around a central loading dock that opened directly onto the water. The largest building, the one that Harrington's people were coming for, the one that held the physical infrastructure of the port contracts and the equipment that made them operational, was a 3-story steel frame structure on the eastern edge of the dock. It had 12 entry points, most of them loading access, 2 of them designed for personnel. Vaughn knew the building the way he knew his own hands. He positioned his people in the 15 minutes before 12:40 with the deliberate quiet of someone who had stopped being angry and started being precise. Anger was a weather system. It moved through and left the terrain changed, but didn't do the work itself. What did the work was the cold arithmetic of positioning and timing, and the knowledge of exactly what he was willing to do and exactly what he was not, and the clarity that came from having crossed, in the last 4 hours, every threshold he had previously held back from. The Harrington team entered the complex at 12:43. They came through the Eastern Personnel Access, the point that Desmond's schedule information had identified as the lowest coverage entry during the midnight rotation gap. They moved well. Vaughn watched from the elevated catwalk on the building's interior second level and noted the professionalism of it. The 2-column entry, the immediate dispersal to cover the interior perimeter, the hand signals that communicated efficiently without sound. These were not casual people. Someone had trained them carefully, or hired them already trained, which was a different and more expensive thing. He counted 14. The operational plan had called for 12. They had added 2, which suggested someone on the Harrington side had made a contingency calculation about resistance. It was a reasonable calculation. It was just too short of what would have actually been necessary. He let them get 20 meters into the building before he hit the lights. The interior of the warehouse went from darkness to full industrial illumination in a single instant, the overhead arrays flooding the space with the harsh, flat light of a place built for work rather than comfort. 14 men in tactical dark clothing stood in that light and understood simultaneously and with professional speed that they were not where they thought they were. What happened next happened in the compressed and specific time that such moments always occupied. Faster than it could be described and slower than it felt, every action carrying the weight of its consequences in the moment of its execution. It was not clean. It was not the controlled interception Vaughn had constructed in his mind. 2 of the Harrington team went for exits that his people were covering, and there were 3 seconds of very loud engagement near the eastern loading bay that he could hear as a physical sensation in his chest from the catwalk 20 meters above. But the structure held, the numbers held, and when the noise stopped and the building's industrial quiet reasserted itself over the ringing aftermath, 11 of the 14 were on the floor with their hands visible, and his people standing over them, and the other 3 had not gone anywhere. They were not intended to go. Vaughn came down from the catwalk. He walked through the building with the specific controlled movement of a man who is holding something very tight inside him and has decided that the holding is more important than the release. He looked at the 11 men on the floor. He looked at the faces he could see. He did not find the face he was looking for. "Where is Gerard Harrington?" he asked the room. Nobody answered. He had not expected them to. He crouched in front of the man who had led the entry team. He could identify the leadership by the position in the column and the pattern of the hand signals he had observed. The man was on his knees, hands behind his head, looking at the floor with the particular blankness of professional training engaged against the pressure of a bad situation. "You're operational," Vaughn said. "You're not policy. You're here because someone paid you to be here and told you what to do. That means you have specific, limited information and a specific, limited reason to protect it." He paused. "I'm not asking you to betray anything structural. I'm asking where Gerard Harrington is tonight." The man looked at the floor, said nothing. "There are 14 of you," Vaughn said. 3 are not currently in this room. The 3 I'm most interested in talking to." He stood. "I have time." Saw it. Marcus found him 20 minutes later near the loading dock's water edge, where the harbor lapped darkly against the concrete and the city's nighttime reflection shattered and reformed continuously on the surface. Vaughn was standing with his phone in his hand and an expression that Marcus, in 11 years, had learned to read as the specific face of a man who has just received information that has changed the geometry of a situation. "What?" Marcus said. Rourke pulled a phone from one of the 3 we recovered separately. Vaughn held his own phone out. On the screen was a message thread. "Look at the last exchange." Marcus took the phone, read. His jaw tightened. The thread was between the recovered man and a contact saved only as a number. The last message, sent at 11:58, 21 minutes before the team had entered the complex, read, "V not at estate. Location unknown. Proceed as planned, but expect possible interference. D confirms interior is clean." Marcus handed the phone back. "D confirms interior is clean." Desmond told them the building was clear as of tonight, which means he knew about the operation in real time, which means he's not just a source, he's active coordination. Active coordination, tonight, while I was standing in a fish processing facility telling my people the truth about him. Vaughn put the phone in his pocket. The harbor moved. He knew we'd pulled the dock team. Someone told him. Marcus went very still. Someone in the room tonight, or someone who heard about the pull order. Vaughn turned from the water. I need to know who made contact with Desmond between 9 p.m. and midnight. Every call, every message, every incidental conversation. He paused. And I need to know where Desmond is right now. Marcus already had his phone out. He made the call, stood listening, and then his face did the thing it almost never did. It changed visibly, the neutral efficiency dropping away from something that was, for a man like Marcus, the equivalent of alarm. What? Vaughn said. Marcus lowered the phone slowly. Desmond's apartment. The surveillance team that was sitting on it. He stopped. Marcus. They're not responding, either of them, for the last 40 minutes. He looked at Vaughn. The car is still there, but nobody's answering. The cold that moved through Vaughn's chest was different from the cold of the harbor wind. It was the cold of a calculation completing itself in a direction he had not accounted for, had not let himself account for, because accounting for it would have required him to believe something about Desmond that even 4 years of documented betrayal had not quite made fully real until this moment. Desmond had not been sitting in his apartment waiting for the operation to play out. Desmond had been moving. Get to that car, Vaughn said. Marcus was already moving. Vaughn followed. They drove the 6 minutes to Desmond's building at a speed that the traffic laws did not accommodate, and that nobody on the empty late-night streets was in a position to object to. The surveillance car, a gray panel van parked at the northwest corner of the block, was dark and still. Marcus pulled up beside it. They both got out. The 2 men inside the van were alive, but they were not conscious, and the smell when Marcus opened the side door explained why. The specific chemical signature of something that had been introduced into an enclosed space. Professional. Efficient. The kind of thing that required preparation and proximity and the specific knowledge of where the surveillance was positioned and what kind of vehicle it occupied. Desmond had known for long enough to prepare, had walked out of his building or been extracted from it, while 2 of Vaughn's people sat 6 meters away and breathed in what he had arranged for them to breathe. Vaughn stood on the empty sidewalk outside his uncle's building and looked up at the lit window on the 4th floor, the same light that the surveillance team had reported as confirmation of occupancy, and understood that the light had been left deliberately, a detail managed by a man who understood that a lit window was the cheapest possible form of misdirection. He went inside. He went up. The apartment door was unlocked. Inside, the lamp in the living room was on. The room was neat and undisturbed in the way of a room that has been left by someone who had time to leave it properly. On the kitchen table, there was a glass of water and a phone, Desmond's regular phone, the one Vaughn's people had been monitoring. And beside the phone, folded once, a piece of paper. Vaughn picked it up. It said in Desmond's handwriting, I know what she found. I know what you know. The question you should be asking is what I know that she doesn't. He turned the paper over. On the other side, 3 words. Ask about Feniers. The room seemed to realign around him. He read it twice. He looked at the phone on the table. Desmond's regular phone, left deliberately, meaning Desmond had another phone, had always had another phone, and he felt something happen in his chest that was not quite any of the things he had already felt tonight. Dr. Feniers. He called Marcus from the doorway. Get to Feniers, right now. Do not call ahead. What? Right now, Marcus. He was already moving back to the stairs. His mind was running the sequence backward. Alara arriving at Feniers, the IV line, the antibiotics, the examination room. The woman who had been treating the organization's injuries for 9 years without visible alarm. The woman who had received Alara without asking questions. The woman whose basement space in the Aldermere district Vaughn had trusted without. He now understood with a sickness that had a specific physical location somewhere beneath his sternum, ever examining the basis of that trust. The basis of that trust was Desmond. Desmond had brought Feniers to the organization 9 years ago. Desmond had vouched for her. Desmond had maintained that relationship for 9 years through his own channel, the existence of which Vaughn had registered as organizational management and not, until this moment, as something that required examination. He drove. He drove the way he had driven to Alara's apartment in the morning, alone, fast, the city thinning to its late-night skeleton around him. He called Alara's phone. It rang. It kept ringing. He called again. Voicemail. The specific fear that moved through him now was not the organizational fear of the evening's earlier hours, not the fear of an operation compromised, a network exposed, a financial architecture at risk. It was something older and less structured than that. It was the fear of a man who had only recently understood the value of something and was now, at speed through empty city streets, calculating whether he had understood it in time. The Aldermere brownstone was dark when he arrived. Not the darkness of a building at 2 a.m. where people were sleeping. The darkness of a building where the lights that should have been on were not. He hit the front steps and went through the main door, unlocked, and down the interior stairs to the basement corridor and through the door of Phineas's treatment space. The examination room was empty. The room where he had left Alara 3 hours ago, the examination table, the IV stand, the shelf of medical reference text, was empty in the specific way that meant it had been vacated deliberately and recently. The IV line was on the table, detached cleanly. The medical supplies that Phineas kept on the counter were partially cleared, not ransacked, selected, taken by someone who knew what she was taking. On the examination table, something had been left. He crossed to it. It was Alara's phone. He picked it up. The screen showed his missed calls, and beneath them, a text message sent from an unknown number to Alara's phone at 1:47 a.m., 26 minutes ago. He read it once and felt the sequence of the night collapse and rebuild itself in the space of 3 seconds. The message said, "She's with me now. The files you gave him are incomplete. There's a third party in this arrangement that your 8 months of surveillance missed entirely. If you want her back, you come alone to the harbor. East Pier, Gate 7. Bring the drives. All of them. You have 40 minutes. It was signed with a single initial, not H for Harrington, not D for Desmond. V. He stood in the empty examination room of a doctor he had trusted for 9 years and held a phone that had been left for him to find and read a message signed with the first letter of a name he did not yet know, from a third party that Alara's 8 months of meticulous surveillance had not identified, and felt the ground beneath every assumption he had made tonight shift in a way that had no clean resolution. Because if there was a third party, then the Harrington operation was not what it appeared to be, and Desmond's role in it was not what the files showed, and the wedding was not the mechanism he had understood it to be. And everything he had built tonight, the positioning at the harbor, the evidence structure, the careful sequencing of consequences, was constructed on a map of a situation that was not the actual situation. 40 minutes. He had 40 minutes to get to East Pier Gate 7 with drives he did not have, because the drives were with Alara, who was with Phineas, who was with whoever had sent this message, and no way to know whether going there was the only way to get her back or the most efficient way to walk into the same kind of trap that had been laid for him at the rehearsal dinner. He looked at the message again. He looked at the initial. He thought about what Alara had said in the examination room 3 hours ago, before he had left for the harbor. I need you to understand that the reason I did all of it, the reason any of it, was not because you paid me to. He put her phone in his pocket alongside his own. He went back up the stairs into the Aldermere night, and the city spread around him in its indifferent enormity, and the harbor was 3 miles east, and the clock that had started when that message was sent was already 23 minutes old, and Vaughn Moreau stood on the sidewalk outside a building that had just revealed itself as one more room in which he had been seen without seeing, and made the only decision that the situation left him with, the decision of a man who has nothing left to protect except the one thing he had 17 minutes left when he called Marcus. East Pier, Gate 7, he said. I need eyes on it before I arrive. Passive only. Nobody moves. Nobody engages. I want to know what's there. What's happening? Marcus's voice had the clipped quality of a man who had been managing emergencies for the last 3 hours and had developed a specific efficiency about receiving new ones. Phineas took Alara. Someone else is running a piece of this that we didn't know about. He was already moving toward the car. Third party, unknown. They want the drives, and they want me alone at Gate 7 in... He checked his watch. 16 minutes. A silence that lasted exactly as long as Marcus needed to process it. You're not going alone. I'm going however I need to go to get her back. He got in the car, started it. Get me eyes. Now. He drove east. The city at 2:40 in the morning was its own reduced geography. The same streets, but emptied of the human volume that gave them their daytime character. The traffic signals cycling through their colors for nobody, the storefronts dark behind their security gates. He drove through it with the particular focus of a man who has reduced everything non-essential and is running on the fuel of what remains, which in his case was rage processed into precision and something else beneath the rage that he was not going to name while he was driving toward a pier in the dark with 16 minutes on a clock. His phone rang. Marcus. 3 vehicles at the gate 7 approach. 2 parked at the access road, 1 closer to the pier structure itself. I count 4 people visible from the position I've got, but there's a blind zone on the pier's north side that I can't cover from here. Fenyes? No visual on her or Alara. The pier structure. Is there a building on it? Old harbor master's office. Converted storage now, about 40 meters from the gate. That was where they would be. Inside, away from exposure, with sight lines to the approach. It was where he would have positioned them. The 2 vehicles at the access road, they're blocking? Semi-blocking. Someone could get through on foot. All right. He was 2 minutes out. Marcus, when I go through that gate, you don't follow unless you hear shots. If you hear shots and then nothing for 5 minutes, you call Rourke and you come in with everyone. If you hear shots and then my voice, you wait. That's a bad protocol. It's the only one that keeps her alive if this goes wrong in a way we don't expect. He paused. The drives? Whoever this is, they asked for drives I don't have, which means the meeting is not actually about the drives. Then what's it about? He turned onto the harbor access road. Gate 7 was visible ahead. A chain-link structure with a sliding mechanism, currently open, which was information. They wanted him to walk in without obstacle. They wanted him inside the perimeter before the conversation started. It's about what they want me to know, he said. Someone who wants drives sends people to take them. Someone who wants you to come alone to a specific location at a specific time. They want to talk. He stopped the car 50 meters from the gate, which means they have something I need, and they know I know that. He ended the call. He got out of the car. The harbor air hit him immediately. Salt and diesel, and the cold coming off the water that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the specific exposed quality of standing at the edge of the city with open water on 3 sides. His footsteps on the access road were quiet. He walked through the gate and followed the pier structure toward the harbor master's building, and the city behind him receded to a glow at the periphery of his vision. And the harbor ahead was black and enormous, and the lights of a cargo vessel moving somewhere beyond the breakwater were the only reference point in that darkness. The door to the harbor master's building was open. He went in. The interior was a single large room with exposed roof beams and the accumulated storage of a decade's worth of dock equipment, crates, coiled lines, instrument housings stacked against the walls. A work light on an extension cord provided the illumination, harsh and directional, casting everything outside its cone into hard shadow. Alara was in a chair near the far wall. Her hands were not bound. He clocked this immediately, and her posture was upright in a way that told him she was functional and alert, though the pallor of her face and the rigidity of her jaw told him the cracked ribs and the stab wound and the accumulated cost of the night were running a tab on her that was coming due. Dr. Fenyes stood beside her, which was a configuration that clarified something he had been uncertain about. Fenyes was not restraining Alara. She was standing beside her the way someone stands beside a person they are responsible for keeping alive. And across the room, leaning against a crate with his arms folded, and the specific ease of a man who is entirely comfortable with the geography of his own power, was a person Vaughn had never seen before. He was perhaps 60, compact build gone slightly soft at the edges, gray suit that was expensive without announcing itself, the kind of face that had the lines of a life spent calculating rather than acting, someone who put other people in motion rather than moving himself. He looked at Vaughn the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for. "You made good time," the man said. "Who are you?" "My name is Conrad Vale." He said it without emphasis, as though the name was information he was providing rather than introducing. "I've been involved in the port infrastructure of this city for approximately 15 years. From a distance. From a very deliberate distance." He tilted his head slightly. "You've never heard of me. That was intentional. Vaughn did not move from where he'd stopped, 6 feet inside the door. He was aware of the room's geometry, the exit behind him, the distance to Alara, the position of Fenyes, the shadows at the room's edges that could contain people or could be simply shadows. He was reading all of it continuously while keeping his attention on Vael's face. "Where's Desmond?" he asked. Something moved across Vael's expression. "Your uncle is on his way out of the city. He has been for about 3 hours. He knew when your surveillance was pulled back. The tell, if you're curious, was the van repositioning. Desmond is detail-oriented. You trained him to be." A pause. "He'll surface somewhere. He usually does." "You're not Harrington." "No. The Harrington family was a mechanism, a useful one. Gerard Harrington is ambitious and not particularly intelligent, which is a productive combination if you know how to direct it." Vael unfolded his arms and moved to a crate that served as a surface, setting his hands on it. "The marriage arrangement was mine. The financial structure underneath it was mine. The Harrington family believed they were acquiring your operation. What they were actually doing was clearing a path." Vaughn heard it and felt it land and said, "For you. The port contracts that your organization controls are worth considerably more than your organization." Vael's voice was the voice of a man delivering an assessment rather than a confession. The shipping infrastructure, the relationships with the regulatory bodies, the labor arrangements at the dock level, these things are not replaceable. They are built over time and they are held by whoever has the right combination of capability and willingness. He looked at Vaughn steadily. "You have both. That's genuinely rare. I want to work with that rather than displace it." The room was very quiet except for the harbor sounds through the structure's walls. Water, distant engines, the creak of the building itself in the wind. Vaughn looked at the man and processed what he was being offered and set it alongside everything that had happened since 6:42 in the morning when the report hadn't come. "You took her," he said. "Dr. Fenyes brought her here safely, yes. She needed to be part of this conversation. She needed to be bait. She needed to ensure you came." Vael said it without apology. "You're not a man who responds to abstract invitations." From across the room, Alara's voice came flat and controlled. "He's been running the Harrington family as a proxy for 3 years. The documentation I have, the third layer I hadn't completed yet, points to Vael's financial architecture underneath theirs. He's not the enemy you were fighting tonight. He's the structure the enemy was built inside." Vaughn did not look at her when she said it, because looking at her would cost him a moment of the focus he needed for the man in front of him. He kept his eyes on Vael. "She didn't know about you until recently. She found the edge of it 2 weeks ago," Vael said. "That's when things accelerated. Harrington's people were sent to her apartment because Harrington panicked, not because I directed it. Gerard Harrington is not good at patience." A pause. "I was disappointed by that." "Disappointed." The word came out of Vaughn at a temperature that made Fenyes take a small step sideways. "She was not supposed to be harmed. She was supposed to be—" Vael stopped, appeared to select the next word with care. Paused. Long enough for the marriage to proceed and for the initial transfer mechanisms to activate, after which the Harrington family's role in the arrangement would have concluded and the actual structure would have revealed itself. And I'd have been dead at the rehearsal dinner. That was Harrington's plan, not mine. Vael said it with the precise distinction of a man who understood that the difference mattered. "I need you operational. I need you running your organization with the same efficiency you've demonstrated for 22 years. I don't need you replaced. I need you incorporated." The word sat in the air of the old harbor master's building like something physical. Vaughn felt his hands, which had been loose at his sides, tighten once, and then deliberately relax. He was aware of his own breathing, the rate of it, the depth of it, in the way he became aware of his own breathing only when something was requiring him to manage it. "Incorporated," he said. "The port contracts run through your legal structure. They stay there. The operational relationships stay yours. What changes is the tier above, the capital structure, the external partnerships, the expansion into the southern corridor that you've been blocked from entering for 4 years." Vael straightened from the crate. "I can open that corridor. I have opened it. I've been holding it available because I knew this conversation was eventually coming. You burned my organization to the waterline to set up a business conversation. I applied pressure to create conditions for a conversation that you would otherwise never have agreed to have. He said it without flinching. You are not a man who entertains approaches. You are a man who responds to reality. So I built a reality. The sound that came out of Vaughn was not a laugh. It was something that had the shape of a laugh and none of its warmth. He took 3 steps forward and watched Viel's body register the reduction in distance without retreating, which told him something about the man's nerve, if not his judgment. You built a reality, Vaughn said. My operations coordinator was stabbed and left to die in her apartment. 2 of my men were chemically incapacitated in a surveillance vehicle. My uncle, a man I trusted, has been sold to your architecture for 4 years and is currently disappearing from this city. And 14 armed people walked into my warehouse tonight, intending to take everything I've spent 22 years building. The 14 people were Harrington's decision. The uncle was a recruitment that predated my involvement with the Harrington family. Stop. The word came out quiet and absolute. Vale stopped. I don't want your accounting of what was yours and what was theirs. I want to know one thing. Ask it. Vaughn looked at the man who had spent 3 years building an invisible architecture around his life and said, Where's the evidence that Alara couldn't find? A pause. Vale's expression shifted. Fractionally, controlled, but real. There is no... She said the 3rd layer was incomplete. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You said she found the edge of it 2 weeks ago, which means there's a layer below what she has. There's a documentation structure that connects your capital to the Harrington operation in a way that would constitute, what? Federal exposure? International? Something that explains why you needed the marriage mechanism rather than a simpler approach. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a line struck against a metal cleat in the wind. A rhythmic, hollow sound. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the expression of a man who has just recalibrated his assessment of the person across from him, he said, You're not what Desmond described. No, I'm not. Alara's voice came again from across the room, still flat, but with something underneath it. Vaughn. Just the name. A warning or a signal. He wasn't sure which. He was sure of the movement in the shadow at the room's left edge, which resolved in his peripheral vision into a figure that had been standing very still against the wall and now was not standing still. He was already moving when the figure moved, not toward the door, not away, but laterally, putting himself between the figure and Alara's chair in a single step that had no calculation in it, only the direct, unreasoned output of an instinct that had been running underneath everything else all night and was now, finally, operating without interference. The figure stopped. It was one of Viel's people, a younger man, solidly built, holding a position that made his function clear. He looked at Viel. Viel said, Stand down. The man stood down. Vaughn remained where he was, between the figure and Alara, and felt her at his back, which was the most specific physical sensation he had experienced in years, and breathed through his nose once and looked at Viel. Here is what happens now, Vaughn said. The steadiness of his voice cost him something he couldn't quantify and didn't try to. You are going to give me everything. The 3rd layer, the capital structure documentation, the Harrington communications that you have that Alara doesn't. All of it. You're going to give it to me because it is the only thing that explains why you arranged this meeting rather than letting tonight play out the way Harrington planned it. And if I do, then we have a conversation, an actual conversation, on my terms, in my space, with my people present. He paused. If you don't, then the evidence we already have goes to people who will use it in ways that are very bad for everyone in this room. And I walk out of here with her, and you manage whatever is left of your position without the port contracts, without the southern corridor access, and without the one person in this city who understands the infrastructure well enough to make any of it work. Viel was quiet for 10 seconds. They were a specific 10 seconds, the kind that have real weight in them, the kind where a decision is actually being made rather than performed. Then he reached inside his jacket and produced a phone and placed it on the crate between them. The access codes for the documentation are on there, he said. You'll need a forensic accountant to interpret the capital structure. Fortunately, I understand you have one. Vaughn picked up the phone without looking at it. He looked at Viel. Get out of this building. We still need to discuss. We will discuss it. Not tonight, not here. His voice was controlled and final and left no room for the conversation to continue. Get out. Take your people. You'll hear from me. Vale looked at him for one more moment with the expression of a man making a final assessment. Then he nodded, once, and moved toward the door. The figure by the wall followed. Phineas looked at Vaughn and then at Alara and then made a decision about which direction was safer and moved toward the door as well. Doctor, Vaughn said. Phineas stopped without turning. We'll discuss your role in this separately. She left. The door of the harbor master's building closed behind them and the room went to its work-like quiet, the harbor sounds filling back in, the creak of the structure, the cold coming through the gaps in the walls. Vaughn turned. Alara was still in the chair. She was looking at him with the same clarity she'd had in the textile facility and the examination room and every room in 7 years. That uncompromising focus that processed what was actually there rather than what was comfortable to see. Her face was bad. The ribs were bad. The night had taken everything she had left after the previous 24 hours and was still collecting. The southern corridor, she said. He's not lying about having access to it. I know. The capital documentation, if it's what he implied, it connects to the Federal Port Authority restructuring from 4 years ago. I had fragments of it. I didn't know what I was looking at. We'll look at it together. He crossed to her. Crouched in front of the chair the way he'd crouched in the textile facility, close enough to see the real cost of the night on her face, in her eyes, in the way she was breathing with the careful rationing of someone working around fractured bone. Can you walk? I walked in. That's still not what I asked. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that had the shape of one. Yes, she said. I can walk. He helped her up the way he had in the textile facility, carefully, adjusting without drawing attention to the adjustment. But this time, when she was upright and her hand was on his arm, he didn't move immediately. He stood in the harsh light of the work lamp with the harbor making its sounds around them and looked at her, and she looked back, and the 7 years between them sat in the air of that room in a way it had never been allowed to sit before. When this is over, he said. You said that already. I mean it more now. She held his gaze for a moment with the expression that was not the operational readiness and not the stripped-down thing from the examination room, but something else, something that had been present in some form for longer than either of them had addressed directly. Then she looked toward the door. Marcus is probably outside. Yes. He's been outside for 40 minutes wondering if you're alive. Also yes. Then let's not make him wonder anymore. They moved toward the door together, his hand at her back, her pace careful and his matched to it. And the door swung open onto the harbor night, the black water, the distant lights, the smell of salt and cold metal, and the particular clean emptiness of a space where something had just resolved. Marcus was 20 meters down the pier, and when he saw them he exhaled something that was visible even at that distance. But 30 meters beyond Marcus, headlights, 2 sets, moving onto the pier access road with a purpose that was not Vale's people departing and was not Rourke arriving, and had the specific configuration of vehicles that had been sent by someone who had been watching the Gate 7 approach from a position outside the perimeter Marcus had been covering. Vaughn stopped. His hand at Alara's back tightened once. Marcus had already turned and was reading the headlights, and his hand was moving toward his jacket, and his voice came across the distance. That's not ours. The vehicles stopped, doors opened, and the figure that stepped out of the lead vehicle into the wash of the harbor access lights was one that Vaughn recognized immediately by the shape of him, by the way he moved, by the specific set of his shoulders that Vaughn had been looking at since he was 16 years old. Desmond Moreau was not on his way out of the city. Desmond Moreau was here, on this pier, with people behind him, and something in his face that Vaughn had never seen there before in 22 years. Something that was not the avuncular warmth or the measured counsel or the practiced ease of a man comfortable in his position. Something that was, stripped of all of that, simply the face of a man who has decided that the conversation is over, and what comes next is not a conversation. He was 40 meters away. He looked at Vaughn across those 40 meters and said nothing for a moment, and the harbor breathed its cold breath, and Alara's hand found Vaughn's arm and gripped it. And Marcus was moving laterally to create an angle, and the figures behind Desmond were spreading from the vehicles in the particular way of people who have been told what to do next and are doing it, And Vaughn Moreau stood at the edge of the harbor in the last moment before everything became irreversible and looked at the man who had raised him and felt something in his chest break clean and cold and final, like ice giving way, and he stepped forward. That was all. One step in front of Alara, between her and the 40 meters of open pier that separated them from Desmond and the people spreading from the vehicles behind him. The step was not heroic. It was not considered. It was the output of something that had been running underneath every calculation of the evening and was now the only thing left running, the raw, ungoverned fact of what he was willing to put his body between. Marcus was moving. Vaughn could track him peripherally, angling left, creating a triangulation, hand already on the weapon at his hip, but not drawing yet because Vaughn had not given the signal, and Marcus, in 11 years, had learned to read the difference between the moment before the signal and the moment of it. Desmond stopped at 30 meters. The people behind him stopped when he stopped. There were 4 of them that Vaughn could see in the harbor access lights, not the trained professionals who had entered the warehouse complex earlier that night, but men of a different category, tighter, less organized, the kind of people someone calls when they need bodies fast and can't be careful about the sourcing. That told Vaughn something. It told him this was not a planned operation. This was a man who had watched his architecture collapse over the course of a single night and had made a decision in the wreckage of it that was not calculated. That was reactive. That was the decision of someone who understood that the evidence now in Vaughn's possession made every future negotiable except one. "You went to see Vale," Desmond said. His voice carried across the pier in the cold air without effort. That voice. Vaughn had heard it all his life. Patient and measured and capable of the particular warmth that authority sometimes deployed to make itself more palatable. It was stripped of the warmth now. What was under the warmth was harder and older and less familiar. "You've been watching the gate." Not a question. "I've been watching everything tonight." Desmond's chin lifted slightly. "I watched you pull the dock team. I watched your people take down the Harrington entry force. I watched you go into that building on the pier." A pause. "I couldn't see what happened inside." "No, you couldn't." "Did he offer you the southern corridor?" Vaughn said nothing. Desmond's jaw moved. "He offered you the southern corridor, and you took the phone he gave you, and you're standing here deciding whether it changes anything." He took a step forward, just one, mirroring the step Vaughn had taken. "It doesn't change anything, Vaughn. Whatever documentation he has, whatever layer he showed you, it comes back to me eventually. My name is in that structure. You can't wall it off." "I know. So." He spread his hands, a gesture Vaughn remembered from 22 years of rooms and tables and the specific performance of a man presenting himself as reasonable. "We talk, like we used to." The harbor made its sounds, water and wind and the distant machinery of ships doing their slow work in the dark. "Tell me one thing," Vaughn said, "before anything else. Tell me one thing that's true." Desmond looked at him across the 30 meters. Something moved across his face that was, Vaughn thought, the closest he was going to come to seeing the actual man underneath the 22 years of performance. "I believed you'd be better positioned as a subordinate to a larger structure than as an independent operator in a shrinking market. I believed it when I started talking to Gerard Harrington. I still believe it." "You believed I'd be better off dead." "The ceremony plan was Harrington's. I told you. You gave him my schedule. You told him when I'd be isolated. You confirmed it was safe to proceed." Vaughn's voice did not rise. The evenness of it was a specific kind of violence. "You gave him the mechanism, whatever you call that?" Desmond was quiet for a moment. The men behind him shifted slightly. The involuntary movement of people who are waiting and are not comfortable with waiting. "I called it necessary," Desmond said finally. And the terrible thing, the thing that landed in Vaughn's chest with a weight he hadn't expected even after everything the night had shown him, was that the man meant it. He had sat with it, had constructed it, had maintained it for 4 years, and in his own internal accounting, it had always been under that heading, necessary. "Uncle," Vaughn said. The word came out differently from any of the other words of the evening. Not harder, not softer, just older. "Put your people back in the vehicles and walk away from this pier." "I can't do that." "You can. It's the only version of this where you get to keep anything." Desmond looked at him. He looked at Marcus, who had completed his lateral movement, and was now positioned at an angle that closed off the vehicles. He looked at Alara, who was behind Vaughn's left shoulder, and the look he gave her was one that Vaughn did not examine directly, because examining it would require him to act on it immediately, in a way that foreclosed the version he was still trying to preserve. "The documentation she has," Desmond said. "It runs to my name for the full 4 years. There is no version where I walk away from this city and maintain anything." "Then you walk away from the city." A silence, long enough that the harbor filled it completely. Then one of the men behind Desmond moved, and everything that had been a conversation became something else. It happened in the particular compressed time of such things, the kind where afterward the human mind struggles to reconstruct the sequence because the sequence had no gaps in it for the mind to insert itself. The man who moved came from Desmond's right, and his target was not Vaughn. The man had made an assessment of angles and chosen what he thought was the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance was behind Vaughn's left shoulder. Vaughn turned and caught the man's arm, and the collision of their bodies was a physical statement, hard and graceless and driven by a momentum that didn't allow for anything measured, and they went down together on the pier's concrete surface, and the impact against his right side was a bright specific pain that he registered and then pushed below the line of what he was willing to pay attention to. The arm he'd caught was controlled. He controlled it completely and held it against the concrete until the man stopped making the decision to fight and started making the decision to stop. And that took 4 seconds that felt like considerably longer. He got up. His side was screaming. He breathed through it. Marcus had engaged the other 3, not alone because Rourke and 2 others had come through the gate during the engagement, alerted by the sound, and the pier became briefly a very loud and very physical place where the harbor's ambient noise was no longer the dominant element. It lasted less than 90 seconds. At the end of it, 4 men were on the pier's surface or against the railing, and Marcus was standing with blood from a cut above his eye and the expression of a man who is taking a brief inventory of his own damage and finding it acceptable. Desmond had not moved. He stood where he'd been standing and watched it end, and his face went through something that Vaughn observed carefully. The collapse of the version he'd arrived at the pier with, the adjustment to the version that remained. He was a man who had spent a lifetime adjusting to versions that remained. It was one of his genuine capabilities, and Vaughn had learned it from him, and the recognition of that was its own specific and private thing to carry. "It's done," Vaughn said. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. His side was a problem he was deferring. "It's done, Desmond." His uncle looked at him. The harbor light was cold and flat, and it showed everything. The age in the man's face, the lines that Vaughn had always read as the marks of experience, and now read as the marks of a life's worth of chosen directions, and the specific exhaustion of a man who had been running a long construction project and had just watched it come down. "What happens now?" Desmond asked. His voice was different. Something had gone out of it. "You come with me," Vaughn said. "Tonight. We sit down with everything Alara has and everything Vale gave me, and we go through all of it, and you fill in the parts that aren't in either." He paused. "Every part. All 4 years." And then Vaughn looked at the man who had taught him how to read a port manifest at 16, and how to read a room at 17, and how to read a person's loyalties at 18, and felt the full weight of what those lessons had cost and what they'd been worth, and the complexity of a debt that could be neither repaid nor forgiven. "And then you're gone," he said. "Not dead. Gone. That's the only offer I'm making tonight, and I'm making it once." Desmond looked at the pier surface. He looked at the water beyond the railing. He looked at Vaughn with an expression that was, in the end, simply the expression of a man who has run out of the options he preferred and is looking at the one that remains. "All right," he said. The estate at 4 in the morning had the quality of a held breath. The staff had been sent to their quarters. The security rotation was running on the restructured schedule that Vaughn had ordered remotely during the drive back, clearing out the positions that Desmond had known and replacing them with configurations that were unknown to anyone who had been speaking to Desmond. The lights in the main wing were low and the rooms were quiet, and the harbor was visible through the rear windows as a dark expanse punctuated by the moving lights of vessels that knew nothing of what had happened on the pier tonight and carried their cargo in complete indifference. Alara was in the guest room on the estate's 2nd floor. "Dr. Fenyes?" whose situation had been deferred but not forgotten, and who understood clearly from the deferral that it had not been forgotten, had been brought in under escort to continue the antibiotic course and to properly address the rib wrapping that had been compromised during the events at the pier. Vaughn had checked on Ilara once, standing in the doorway while Phineas worked, and Ilara had looked at him from the bed with the clear-eyed steadiness that was simply the way she looked at things and said, "Go deal with the rest of it." And he had. The rest of it took until nearly 6 in the morning. Desmond sat across from Vaughn in the estate's library, a room that had the accumulated atmosphere of serious conversations, the kind of room that had been used for decisions and had retained something of their weight in the air. Rourke stood near the door. Marcus sat to one side. Between Vaughn and Desmond on the table was a tablet displaying Ilara's documentation and Vale's phone's contents, and Desmond went through all of it with the methodical attention of a man honoring the terms of the only agreement left to him. He filled in the parts that weren't in the files. The initial contact with Gerard Harrington had been made at a Port Authority reception, the kind of event that brought together the legitimate and illegitimate sides of the harbor economy in a setting where both could pretend the categories didn't exist. Harrington had approached Desmond, not the other way, had made an assessment over several meetings of what Desmond's position in Vaughn's organization could provide, had offered a structure of compensation that Desmond had described to himself at the time as security, a hedge against the instability he genuinely believed Vaughn's independent operation represented in a market he genuinely believed was consolidating beyond the capacity of independent operators to survive. Vaughn listened to this without speaking. The intelligence transfers had been incremental, small pieces, individually defensible, that accumulated over time into something that was neither small nor defensible. The staffing rotation, the financial architecture, the warehouse configurations, the wedding arrangement itself, which Harrington had brought to Desmond as a concept, and which Desmond had presented to Vaughn as if it had originated from neutral intelligence about the Harrington family's own ambitions. In the framing Desmond had built for himself, he had been managing a transition. In the framing the evidence supported, he had been building a mechanism for his nephew's removal from everything he'd spent his life constructing. At 5:40, Desmond stopped. He set his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. "I told myself it was practical," he said. "I told myself it for long enough that it became the only thing I could hear." Vaughn looked at him. The exhaustion of the night was in every part of his body now. The deferred pain from the pier had stopped deferring around 3 a.m., and his side was a constant specific argument. But the exhaustion was clean in the way that the exhaustion of something finished is clean. Not comfortable, not painless. Clean. "The practical thing," Vaughn said, "would have been to come to me." Desmond said nothing. 4 years ago. If you believed what you say you believed about the market, about independent operations, about where things were going, you could have come to me and made the argument. I would have listened. Would you? "I don't know," Vaughn said, because it was the honest answer, and Desmond had given him enough honest answers over the last 2 hours that he owed one back. "But you would have been alive to find out." His uncle looked at him across the table in the library, and the 22 years and the 4-year shadow that had fallen across all of them. He looked old in the way that people look old when something they were using to hold themselves upright has been removed. "Marcus," Vaughn said, without looking away from Desmond, "get him ready to travel." He stood. He left his library without another word to the man at the table, because the words were done, and what remained was only the logistics of an ending, and the logistics he could manage without being present for them. He went upstairs. He knocked on the guest room door and heard Ilara's voice and went in. Phineas was gone. The room had the early gray light of approaching dawn coming through the curtains, and Ilara was sitting up in the bed with a legal pad on her knee and a pen in her hand and reading glasses he had never seen her wear pushed up on her forehead, and the sight of her working at 5:45 in the morning with cracked ribs and a fresh stab wound and a face that bore the full visible record of the previous 36 hours was the most specific thing he had felt all night. "You should be unconscious," he said. "I've been going through Vale's documentation structure." She held up the legal pad, which was covered in the precise notations he had spent 7 years watching her produce. "The Southern Corridor access is real, and the capital connection to the Federal Port Authority restructuring is what I thought it was. It's not criminal exposure for us. It's criminal exposure for 3 people on the regulatory side who've been holding the corridor closed. Vale has been holding that documentation as leverage over them for 4 years. which is why he couldn't just buy the corridor. He needed an operator already in position to make use of it. He needed you, specifically. She set the pad down. He's not wrong about the market consolidation, by the way. Desmond wasn't wrong about that either. The independent operation landscape is compressing. The corridor access changes the calculation, but only if it's managed correctly. Vaughn pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed, and sat in it with the weariness of a man at the end of a very long night and the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Which means the veil conversation is going to have to happen, properly, on documented terms, with legal architecture around it. I know that too. And Phineas is going to need to be Elara." He said her name the way he'd said it on the pier, not as a professional address, not as the organizational relationship that had been the container for everything between them for 7 years, just as a name, her name, the one belonging to the specific person sitting in front of him. "The documentation will be there tomorrow." She looked at him. She had the reading glasses still pushed up on her forehead, and the legal pad on the blanket beside her, and the pen still in her hand, and her face was a record of everything the last 2 days had cost, and her eyes were the same as they had always been. Clear, direct, processing what was actually there, rather than what was comfortable to see. She set the pen down. "Desmond?" she asked. "Handled." "Harrington? The organization is structurally destroyed. The evidence Rourke's team pulled from the warehouse tonight goes to people who will ensure the Harrington family has more immediate concerns than the port contracts." He paused. "Gerard Harrington is going to have a very difficult month. And Celeste?" He thought about the woman who had walked into his penthouse with a florist's portfolio and a smile engineered to disarm, who had said, "I'm sure she's fine," with a precision he now understood completely, who had made a phone call at 11:58 that had accelerated a timeline and nearly killed 2 of his men and nearly killed Elara, and had, in its way, set in motion the sequence of events that had brought him to this chair in this room at this hour. Celeste knew the broad shape of it, he said. Whether she knew the specific, the rehearsal dinner, the mechanism, I'm less certain. She'll have the opportunity to explain the distinction. He paused. From a distance, Elara nodded slowly. The room was quiet. The harbor light was beginning to change outside the curtains. The particular shift of water-reflected light that preceded actual dawn, the gray brightening towards something that wasn't yet color. 7 years, she said. Yes. You didn't know. It was not an accusation and not a question. It was an observation of a fact offered as such. No, I watched you for a long time before I decided. Her voice was careful, not guarded, careful. The way she was careful with things that mattered. The way you made decisions. The way you treated the people in your organization. Not the inner circle, the people at the edge of it. The ones who could have been treated as disposable and weren't. She paused. It took me a long time to be certain you were the person I thought you were. How long? About 3 years. The corner of her mouth moved. The other 4 I spent building the case. He looked at her. The window light was changing behind the curtains. Somewhere in the estate below, Marcus was handling the logistics of Desmond's departure, and Rourke was managing the aftermath of the night's various events, and the city was beginning its mourning processes in complete ignorance of what had happened inside it while it slept. I have a question, he said. Ask it. The morning report. Every day for 7 years, 6:15 without exception. He held her gaze. Was that? My job, she said immediately. Yes, but also. A pause. The harbor light moved through the curtains in its slow shifting way. She looked at him with the expression that was not the operational readiness, and not the stripped down thing from the examination room, and not the almost humor from the textile facility, but something underneath all of them. Something that had been present for 7 years and had simply been waiting in its own methodical way for the conditions that would allow it to be named. Also that, she said, he reached out and took her hand, not the grip of crisis, not the moment on the pier when her hand had found his arm in the harbor dark. Something slower and more deliberate. Her hand was cold from the room's early morning temperature, and he held it, and she let him hold it with the specific quality of someone who has decided that letting something happen is not the same as surrendering to it, but is its own kind of choice. They sat in that room while the dawn came. 3 weeks later, the city had a different shape. The Harrington organization's collapse was a matter of public record by the end of the first week. Not the criminal architecture, which was moving through channels that operated on a slower and more consequential timeline, but the business infrastructure. Companies that had been quietly positioned around Vaughn's operation over 3 years of patient acquisition began returning to their natural configurations under the pressure of documentation that had been placed carefully and through the right hands into the right positions. The Port Authority restructuring, the 3 regulatory figures whose leverage Vale had been holding, became a matter of federal inquiry sometime in the second week, which Vaughn observed from a distance with the specific satisfaction of a man watching a contained fire do exactly the work it was designed to do. Celeste Harrington left the city in the second week. She did not contact Vaughn before she left. He had not expected her to. Desmond Moreau was somewhere in the world that was not this city. The terms of his departure had been specific and had been, as far as anyone had been able to determine, honored. Vaughn did not look for reports of him. He did not expect to hear from him again, and the silence that occupied the space where that relationship had been was not comfortable and was not supposed to be. It was the silence of an accurate accounting, and he lived with it the way he had learned over 22 years to live with the accurate accountings that couldn't be made comfortable. Dr. Fenyes had provided a full account of her arrangement with Desmond, a relationship that had begun as a genuine referral and had evolved over 9 years into a secondary reporting obligation that she had rationalized with the same mechanisms that Desmond had used and that produced the same results. Her future in the organization was a question that remained under deliberate consideration. She knew this. Conrad Vale had called on the 8th day. The conversation had been different from the harbor master's building. Measured, documented, conducted over a secure line with Alara present, and taking notes with the focused attention of someone who would be reconstructing the full architecture of the proposed arrangement before anyone signed anything, or agreed to anything, or moved in any direction that couldn't be moved back from. The Southern Corridor access was real. The terms of its use were negotiable. The negotiation was ongoing and was going to take time, which was appropriate because the things worth building always did. The organization, Vaughn's organization, intact, restructured, at its foundations in ways that reflected what the previous weeks had revealed about which foundations had been sound and which had been something else, continued its operations. The harbor moved its cargo. The port contracts held. The people at the edge of the structure, the ones Alara had once told him he treated as something other than disposable, were still there, still working, their positions untouched by the earthquake that had moved through the levels above them. Alara came back to work on the 14th day. Not to her office in his building. She had a different setup now, in a space on the estate's eastern wing that had been configured to her specifications, and that had the same dual monitor arrangement and the same functional without decorative quality as the apartment in Thornfield, but with several differences that reflected the different nature of what she was now. The title had changed. The access had changed. The relationship that governed the access had changed in ways that didn't fit neatly into any of the organizational categories that had previously organized everything between them. She had not complained about any of it. She had also not made it simple. She was not a woman who made things simple when complexity was more accurate and the nature of what they were building, professionally, personally, in the overlap between those categories that they were both still mapping, was genuinely complex and was not going to resolve into something clean just because they had both decided to stop pretending it wasn't there. He found this, to his own considerable surprise, not difficult but interesting. After 22 years of a life that had been built on the management of complexity, the specific complexity of another person who was fully capable of managing her own complexity without his involvement was the most engaging problem he had encountered. She found this, he suspected, at least partly amusing. She had not confirmed this directly. She communicated some things through the same channels she had always used: the annotated reports, the direct speech, the precise identification of problems that required addressing, and other things through the channels that had always existed between them and were now simply no longer required to be invisible. On a morning at the end of the 3rd week, they stood together on the estate's rear terrace. The harbor was visible from here in a way it was visible from very few places in the city, a wide, unobstructed view across the water to the breakwater and beyond, the container ships moving on their routes, the cranes standing against a sky that had, after days of the gray that the season imposed, finally cleared to something blue. The morning was cold. The harbor was the color of hammered steel in the early light. Ilara had a coffee in both hands, wrapped around it in the way of someone who is using the warmth as much as the contents. She was looking at the water. She was wearing a sweater that was too large for her, and she had not done anything with her hair, and the healing marks on her face were fading to yellow at the edges. She looked like someone who had been through something and had not pretended otherwise. He stood beside her with his own coffee and looked at the harbor they had spent a very difficult week fighting to keep, and thought about the 22 years that had built the thing worth fighting for, and the 7 years that had contained in its operational and procedural surface something else entirely that had now come to the surface in the way that things come to the surface when the circumstances finally require honesty. "The Vale meeting is Tuesday," she said. "I know. I want to bring in an external forensic accountant for the capital structure review. Not Fenyez, not anyone from the current structure, someone outside." "Do you have someone?" "I have 3 candidates. I'll have a recommendation by end of day." He looked at the side of her face, the healing marks, the set of her jaw, the way she looked at the harbor with the same attention she brought to everything, the quality of attention that missed very little and described what it found with precision. "Ilara." She turned her head and looked at him. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the clear, direct attention that was simply how she looked at things. Then she looked back at the harbor. "The accounts are balanced," she said. It was what it meant, in the language they had built between them. It was enough. It was acknowledged. It was filed correctly and did not need further annotation. But then, after a moment, in a voice that was slightly different from the professional register, not softer exactly, but less managed, "Don't make me do this again." He felt the thing in his chest that had been there since the textile facility. That particular warmth and weight of something real and present that didn't require him to name it precisely to know what it was. "No," he said, "I won't." They stood at the edge of the harbor they had saved. The city spread behind them in its morning configuration, beginning the processes of the day, and the water moved in its ancient, indifferent way, and the cranes stood at their work, and the ships moved their cargo through the cold morning light. The harbor was his. It had always been his. But standing at the edge of it now, with this woman beside him, and the full weight of what the previous 3 weeks had cost and cleared and built in its wake, it felt less like possession and more like responsibility. The kind that arrives when you finally understand what something is actually worth and what it actually required of you to keep it. He had paid that price. She had paid more. The difference between them was not something he intended to let persist. Below, the harbor moved. The city woke. The empire that had been tested and had held, not because it was invulnerable, but because the people inside it had decided, at the moments when the decision mattered, to hold, continued its operations in the morning light. The enemies were gone. The betrayals were accounted for. The reckoning had been paid in the currency it required. And on the terrace above the water, 2 people stood with their coffee in the cold morning air and looked at what they had come through and what remained was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning of something that didn't need to be named yet, that would reveal its own shape, as real things did, in the living of it. The harbor glittered in the morning light. The shadows were gone.